Are you ready to make the most of your oil and gas mineral rights? Welcome to the Mineral Rights Podcast. Get the knowledge and resources you need to manage your minerals and royalties. Here is your host, Matt Sands.
Hello and welcome to the Mineral Rights Podcast. I'm your host, Matt Sands, and I'm here to help you make the most of your minerals and royalties. This week, we talk about estate planning and mineral rights with attorney Ben Kinney with the Kinney Law Office. There are so many useful tips that we talk about during this episode that I'm sure this will end up as one of our most popular ones yet. And I can't wait for you to hear it. But before we get to it, if this episode or any of the other episodes that you've listened to has proved to be helpful to you, all that I ask is a quick favor for you to leave a rating and review on Apple Podcasts or wherever you're listening to this. This is the best way to help us out, and thank you in advance for your help in getting the word out about the show so that others can benefit from this information as well. So let me tell you a little bit of background information on Ben Kinney before we dive in. Ben's law practice helps clients develop asset protection strategies to protect and manage their wealth. He supports the hardworking families in Colorado and Wyoming with estate planning, mineral rights, and other legal needs. The Kinney Law Office builds comprehensive strategies and solutions for clients using estate planning tools like wills, trusts, and family companies, along with other strategies to help families build and protect wealth. They leverage legal expertise, technology, and information to support each client. Prior to entering private practice as a personal family lawyer, Ben spent more than 10 years advising foreign governments and individuals on legal, regulatory, and policy issues related to energy development and management of mineral resources. He now provides that same high-level wealth and strategy advisory service to families in Wyoming and Colorado. So without further ado, here's our guest, Ben Kinney with the Kinney Law Office. Welcome, Ben, to the Mineral Rights Podcast. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks for having me. It's a real pleasure to be here.
Well, now before we get talking about estate planning, which I know everybody listening is anxious to hear about and to find out some of the tips and tricks in order to make the most of their minerals, I want to get started with a question that we ask all of our guests just to give a little bit of background. What got you interested in the law and becoming an attorney?
Oh boy, that's a great question. I'm one of the lucky people who knew from a pretty young age what I wanted to do. I had two cousins that went to law school that were from the same hometown that I was. As I was growing up, as I was in high school, they were traveling the world and seeing different places, and I thought that sounded like a pretty good way to make a living. And so I knew, I would say from about the age of 9 or 10, that going to law school and being an attorney is what I wanted to do.
Wow, that is awesome. I know that I kind of can relate to that from an engineering point of view. When I was growing up, it was either becoming an astronaut or an engineer, and that's probably about the same age. But that is definitely early for knowing that you want to become an attorney. I think you may be the first person that has told me that.
Well, sometimes it happens fast. Other people come to the realization later on, but I was lucky. It was an example, and especially the chance to travel abroad, chance to travel internationally, to work on the types of issues that they were working on, just got my interest right away, and I knew what I wanted to do.
That's cool. And speaking of internationally, I know that you have an international practice and you do some consulting internationally. And while most of our listeners are based here in the US, can you talk to us a little bit about what that entails and kind of how you got involved with that?
Sure. So I'll answer the second question first. I got involved with the international practice right out of law school. Before I went to law school, I traveled abroad, did a study abroad in Russia, spent a year there. And then when I went to law school, I knew that I wanted to get involved in international work somehow. And I was in law school at the University of Wyoming and knew I wanted to do international energy work, and met a professor my second and third year of law school that did basically the work that I'm doing now. He was doing international consulting, working on oil and gas issues in different countries. And so the way I got involved with doing the international work, I asked him how he did it. He said, well, I have this project right now that I'm working on, and they need a full-time attorney on the ground, and you're This was the just before I took the bar exam after my third year. He said, "Are you interested in doing it?" And I said, "Absolutely." And he told me where it was and he said, "Are you still interested in doing it?" And I said, "Absolutely." And so that's how I got started.
And where was that first project located?
So that first project was in Afghanistan. I spent 2 years working in Kabul, Afghanistan, with the Ministry of Mines.
And was this after 9/11 and after that whole situation going down, or when was this?
This was 2010. So yeah, it was. We were at war, and it was a war zone, and you knew right away when you got there that you had gotten into something, and were you were not in Kansas anymore, as they say.
Yeah, I can only imagine what that was like. So you having to wear like body armor and that kind of thing driving around town, or was it like more stable at that point?
This was 2010, 2011 when I was there, and it was more stable at that point. It was right during the surge, so there were 100,000 American soldiers. There were still incidents and things that happened, but it was certainly a different country then than it is now.
Wow, that's pretty amazing. And so I guess that's continued since then. I know you've done other international consulting jobs. And just to highlight, maybe what was the most interesting project you've worked on internationally so far?
Well, yeah, I've been in more than a dozen countries since then. Each one of them has their own kind of unique quirks or their own unique issues that they're trying to work out. That's what one of the things that I think makes the international work really interesting. But I would still say that my favorite project to work on was the first one. Spending that time in Afghanistan, getting to work side by side with our counterparts there and getting to work side by side with the Afghans that were there. It was a really good experience. Made you feel like you were using your skills and doing the things to do something to help people and to help in it, something that was bigger than you. And I still enjoy that project, and I still think of that one as probably one of my favorites.
Cool. And you mentioned the interest in energy law, but can you talk a little bit more about that and sort of how you got interested in mineral rights and in the estate planning side of things as well? Because I understand those are sort of two-year specialty areas.
Sure. So the mineral rights is something that's very unique to the United States. The United States is either one of or the only country in the world that allows private ownership of minerals. Every other country I work in, I work directly with the government, and that's because in every other country in the world, the government owns the minerals. So I had been doing the international consulting and was looking for just some additional things that I could do here in Colorado to continue working in the energy industry, but to use the experience I'd had, counseling governments and talking to governments about these things, to talk to the mineral owners here, which were individuals. And so it was a natural fit for me to kind of start that. But it's a very different atmosphere here than it is in anywhere else in the world, just because of that private ownership of minerals.
Yeah, it is definitely a unique and scenario that I'm thankful for, given that opportunity to own minerals. It can be a huge benefit, which we're going to talk about, and being able to pass that down to your heirs. And so estate planning is a big part of that, I know. So before we get started talking about that, what states are you licensed to practice in?
Licensed in Colorado and Wyoming.
Okay. And kind of an out there question, but just to help educate us on some of the interesting things going on in your specialty area or just in the law in general, what are some of the things that are related to the law that you're most interested in or researching the most right now?
Well, right now my focus is really on building out estate planning. It's a newer practice area for me, even though it blends a lot of the things that I've been doing before. So I'm spending a lot of time looking at mineral rights and looking at different mechanisms and always trying to get better at that process. Working abroad and doing that kind of work, I'm always interested in the contracts and in the authorizations, in the tender and bidding processes, how the mineral rights get bid on, how they get transferred over to the companies, how the companies do the work, and just those governance documents. Right now, there's a lot of force majeure claims being made. There's a lot of delay that's happening because of coronavirus and the change in the economic circumstances. So there's bankruptcies going on. I mean, there's one of the most interesting things about the law, and one of the things that even after doing this for 10 years, that I still love about it is that it's always changing. There's always more you can learn, and there's always more things that you can add on. And there's always something going on that's bringing up a new set of circumstances that we haven't seen before. So it's always shifting, and there's always more to learn.
I think that's a great outlook to have on it. All right, and we'll kind of get into the nuts and bolts here. With that out of the way, let's talk a little bit about estate planning. But before we dive in, just a reminder that we're sharing this for informational purposes only. The episode should not be construed as legal or tax advice. You should not act or refrain from acting on the basis of any content discussed without seeking legal advice from counsel in your relevant jurisdiction. All right. So now, estate planning, from my experience, it seems like this is an area where mineral owners overlook. And this is evidenced by heirs that are surprised to find out that they've inherited minerals. And then they are often faced with a daunting task, having to get clear title to get the property in their name and all that fun stuff that comes with that. Has that been your experience as well, Ben?
Yeah, I mean, that's definitely been my experience. And that's one of the reasons that I got into estate planning initially anyway. The people inheriting minerals, they'll keep these in their own name, or they won't take care of them the way that you would a business. It's kind of passive income. And so people get passive about, managing them, managing the mineral rights, taking care of the mineral rights. And I've gotten calls for as long as I've had my practice open for people who have been surprised to learn that they own minerals because, dad had them, grandpa had them, grandma had them, and then they're finding out that they have these and then trying to figure out what to do with them. And those are in cases where they've inherited them. Other cases, somebody knocks on the door and is offering them a lease, and they have no idea that they even owned minerals in this place. So it's definitely a big issue, and definitely something that I try and talk to mineral owners about when I discuss it. So
Absolutely. And, I think that's our experience as well. And kind of a place to start here. I know that probate can be an expensive and time-consuming process for heirs to deal with. First, for those listening that might not know what is probate?
So probate is a way for the court to disperse your assets. Certain assets you have pass outside of probate. If you have life insurance or something like that, it goes directly to the beneficiary and doesn't have to go through court. One of the things that's unique and interesting about mineral rights is that mineral rights are considered real property interests. So if you're transferring them through a will, or if you're transferring them in that probate process, they always have to be probated. And so probate's it's kind of a fancy term for the court looking at your will and then dividing up the stuff that's in your will.
Sure. And I know if minerals are included or any real property, but other than that, do all wills need to go through the probate process? And this may vary per state too.
A will always needs to go through probate. Yeah. There's a simplified probate that you can use, or there's affidavits that you can use in certain cases where you may not have very many assets, or you may not have a lot of assets, but a will always has to go through the probate process.
Sure. And, when most people think of probate, they think of it as a once and done ordeal. I know with minerals, you hear every so often for the need to reopen a probate for one reason or another. Is this something you encounter often? And what are some examples of why this would need to occur?
Wow. In minerals, yeah, this happens unfortunately very often. I've had 4 cases so far just in the last few months where mineral rights were not transferred appropriately. Mineral rights were never transferred. The estate, at some point, whoever was doing the acting as the executor of the estate, decided that the mineral rights probably weren't worth anything, and so they didn't open a probate somewhere to get those transferred. So this happens. This happens a lot, and a lot more than you would hope. And it's unfortunate because a mineral right is real property. If you own mineral rights in 4 states, you have to open probate proceedings in all 4 of those states in order to get those mineral rights transferred. That's one thing if those mineral rights are producing, $10,000 or $15,000 a year in income. It can be a really frustrating thing if those mineral rights are producing, $100 a year in income, and you've got to go through, a $3,000 or $4,000 probate process in 4 different states just to get those mineral rights transferred the way that they're supposed to be. So it's not always taken care of, and it's not always handled. And this happens a lot more than you would think.
Absolutely. And I can testify to it in my specific circumstance. That's exactly what has happened. And like you say, it can be a really challenging process, not only to research, but then to take whatever legal action you need to take for maybe an unknown amount of dollars or no dollars. And to piggyback on that, what is a way that our listeners can help to prevent that from happening to their estate and to their beneficiaries? Is there a good rule of thumb, or just try to be thorough?
One, know what you own. And two, make sure that it's not held in your name. Either put the mineral rights into a trust or put them into a family owned corporation or put them into some other type of device so that you're not holding those in your own name. If you can get them into a trust, you can pass those mineral rights along without having to go through the probate process. Items in a trust are owned by the trust, and then the trust disperses income or manages those mineral rights after you're gone. So, I always give the advice to my mineral owner clients that, look, it's great that you have these. We've sorted out that you have these, but now you need to get them out of your name and get them into some other kind of vehicle so that you can manage them properly.
Sure. And I think, is it safe to say using a trust or a family LLC, that's one good way to keep from saddling their heirs with a mountain of paperwork as well, right?
It really is. And it's a way to avoid, like the example we were using earlier, where if you have mineral rights in 4 different states, you don't have to go through probate in 4 different states because you as an individual don't have those mineral rights. Those mineral rights belong to the trust, and then the monies that those generate can be dispersed according to the trust itself. But the mineral rights, if they're held by the trust, they don't have to go through that probate process. So yeah, I mean, it's a great way to avoid that headache of having to go to 4 different attorneys in 4 different states and pay, you know, thousands of dollars to get all this stuff transferred.
Sure, absolutely. And I know it might be a hard concept for people to understand, but I think when you have minerals, is it safe to say that just having a will and keeping the inventory is really not necessarily enough to make it at least easy for your beneficiaries, if not the best way to go about it?
Well, I mean, it certainly helps, right? I mean, it helps when you know what you own and you know what you don't own, or what's happened, and if you've sold mineral rights in the past, or if you've acquired them in other places. It certainly helps to have that inventory. It certainly helps to have at least a will so that you know where those things are at. But for privacy reasons, for management reasons, setting up a trust or setting up an LLC is something that I personally think that every mineral owner should do.
Sure. And you kind of mentioned this as well, but the ways that mineral owners can avoid their estate going through the probate process, you mentioned trust. What about ownership of minerals in an LLC? Does that kind of serve the same purpose, or what's that look like?
It serves the same purpose. I mean, really, what you're trying to do to avoid having to go through the probate process is get those out of your name individually. So if your minerals are owned by either a family company or even a single member LLC, transferred ownership to those entities, and then the mineral rights pass in accordance with what your LLC operating agreement says, or with what the trust says. So if you have a family company and you own all the minerals in a family company, then when you pass on, then the company continues to own the minerals, and ownership of the company passes in accordance with your operating agreement. So it's there's a lot of ways that you can avoid it. It just needs to be done that way and needs to be set up that way from the beginning.
Okay. And once you have that all situated, I mean, I know there's some estate tax potential implications for whatever decisions that are made. So I guess that's another thing to think about. But just in general, can you talk about what are some of the other strategies that mineral owners should be aware of when it comes to transferring ownership to their heirs, both from that ease of use or ease of transfer standpoint and avoiding probate like we've been talking about, but that also from like an estate tax point of view? Is there sort of a general strategy that you could describe?
Okay, so for estate taxes, and I want to go back to the disclaimer real quick and make sure that people understand I am an estate planning attorney, but I'm not a tax attorney, and I'm not really a tax advisor. So the few things that I can say about taxes, though, your estate tax exemption right now is $11.4 million. And so you have $11.4 million in assets that you can transfer without having to pay estate taxes at all. And if you're married, that number doubles. So, with a $22.8 million exemption, the estate tax is only going to hit like 1% of US households anyway. But with mineral rights, if you have a big enough mineral right holding, then it's something that you need to be thinking about and be doing some planning. with the estate taxes. The other thing that I would say, managing minerals from, maybe from a tax perspective, there's a process of educating people and educating your heirs or your kids or whoever it is that's going to take these things on about what it takes to actually manage and run the minerals. Because it's a passive income asset, people don't always think about it the way that you would think about, a family business or maybe a business interest that you own. If you own part of a strip mall or a shopping park, you think about those as real estate assets, and those things generate money. And you think about you need to do improvements. You need to have tax advisory services. You need to get tenants in for those things. And I think people, for some reason, think mineral rights are something different just because they think it may be a passive income asset. But there's really a lot of things as a mineral owner that you need to be doing, from checking revenue statements to watching for new drilling activity to just keeping track of what's happening with your mineral rights. People tend to neglect those, and especially they neglect those when they're talking to their kids about what they own and what kind of a business interest that they have. And so I would say, from not really an estate tax standpoint, but from a transfer standpoint, working with your kids, working with your heirs, working with whoever's going to be taking over those mineral rights to help them understand what they're getting into, understand some of the basics of the business, and understand how to manage it and continue to manage it properly. Those are some things that mineral owners can do to help ease that transition process.
Sure. Well, I think that's a great piece of advice. I think that educating them, it makes a lot of sense. Now, when you do estate plans for clients, what makes an estate plan complicated? Is it dependent on the number of beneficiaries or the number of properties that I imagine can increase the complexity? Just does the complexity of an estate plan determine which legal instrument is the right fit for that estate plan? Or can you talk us through sort of that process that you go through in determining which way to go for an individual?
Okay. Sure. So estate plans, I hear this a lot from people that they think estate plans are complicated, or they think that it's difficult to put together. The number of beneficiaries that you have in your estate plan doesn't really make that much difference. I mean, it's really just a record keeping exercise. So if you're giving your estate out to one person or to 50 people, that doesn't really do much to make my job any more difficult. And I could say the same thing with properties. As far as the complexity goes, whether you have one mineral property or whether you have 50 mineral properties, it doesn't really change the overall complexity of the plan. The plan is still, we're going to put these into a trust. I do a lot of revocable living trusts. I do a lot of trust-based planning, just because I do work with mineral owners. But we put the mineral rights into the trust, and then the trust administers, the distributions that come out of that. What really makes estate planning complicated is when you need to create multiple trusts, when you're trying to create trusts for each different child, when you're trying to create different kinds of trusts to avoid, either an estate tax issue, or when you've got blended families, when you've got some other family dynamics that are going on that you're trying to work out. So the number of beneficiaries, the number of mineral properties don't really change the complexity of the trust. Family dynamics and family circumstances and situations can really make a big difference in the complexity and the overall complexity of my work. So it it has less to do with numbers and a lot more to do with just the people involved and the specific situation.
Okay. No, that helps me understand. Thanks for that. And again, I can imagine it totally depends on a person's specific situation, but in general, let's talk about some of the best types of entities to hold minerals in from an estate planning point of view. You've mentioned trusts. We've talked about a family LLC. Are there others? And then what are some of the advantages and disadvantages of these different structures?
Well, that's a great question. The trust itself gives you a lot of privacy because these mineral rights are not going through a court process, or not going through the probate process. They're not necessarily public, even though it's you owning those mineral rights is public record. But the amount of money that you make off of those can be kept private. The trust also gives you the ability to control the disbursements that are made and how those disbursements happen, what that money can be used for, who can have access to it. So it's a great way if you want to protect your assets into the future and protect your kids from lawsuits or creditors or divorce even. You can put the minerals into a trust, and then the distributions from that trust, creditors or a former spouse or something like that can't reach back and reach into those mineral rights in the trust to get access to those. And there's ways to set that up. With a family corporation, a family corporation is a way to, I think, take that educational piece, and you get your kids involved or you get your heirs involved with how to manage those minerals. And I think just because it's a corporation, it gives the advantage of people thinking about it more like a business, and handling it as if it's a business interest. And so you get some benefits there, and I would imagine, there's tax consequences along the way. For more information on those, you're going to have to talk to your tax advisor. And those tax benefits and changes will definitely depend on how you own those minerals, and whether you have those in a trust or in a family corporation, and things like that. But so there's some tax advantages, but there's also, I think between the trusts and between the LLCs, there's some privacy advantages, or there's some asset protection strategies that you can use with the trust that you couldn't necessarily use with the LLC.
Okay, thanks. And, I don't know that this is necessarily a disadvantage, but I guess, keeping these up to date is probably important. I saw you had a blog post recently about Kobe Bryant and his trust, and the fact that he had not updated it to include his youngest child. And so that was creating some issues. And so I guess that's something to be aware of, that people need to keep these things up to date. Is that right?
Oh boy, not only up to date, you need to set it up properly to begin with. One of the clients that I had a few years ago had inherited mineral rights from, I think it was her mother. There were some siblings that had inherited mineral rights, but her mom had gone through and actually done estate planning and spent, I don't know, $4,000, $3,000, $4,000, $5,000, whatever it was, to set up a revocable living trust and a will and a pour over will, and do all of these estate planning things. What didn't happen though is the mineral rights were never transferred into the trust. And when the mom died, the trust was protecting a grand total of $10. So you spent, $4,000 to protect $10 in assets. So there's two things, and there's two parts of that. The first one is, making sure that if you're going to go through this estate planning process, that you go through and properly fund the trust. And then you also have to make sure that you're capturing everything that you own and making sure all of that gets into the trust. And then, I guess the third of two things is to keep it up to date and make sure that if you're selling property, if you're selling your mineral rights, that you make that a note of that. If you're buying in new mineral rights, that those go into the trust as well. So through my office, I've got a process where it's a continuous follow-up that we do to make sure that if something in your life changes, if you have a kid, if you buy a new house, if you buy new mineral rights, we check in frequently to make sure that, look, if there's anything that's happened that's going to mean that you need to change your estate plan, that we have a follow-up process with our clients. And it's something that estate planning attorneys are doing more, but certainly it's something that estate planning attorneys have not done enough of. And you see the impact of that when you start working with clients.
Sure. Yeah. And you mentioned trusts. Now, you mentioned the revocable living trust, I think it was, but what are some of the types of trusts that are common in terms of transferring minerals into them from an estate planning point of view?
The most frequent one that I would say that I use is a revocable living trust. It's an easy entity to set up. It's easy to administer. It handles the things that you need to handle with it. You can set up irrevocable living trusts or irrevocable trusts, and those have a lot more restrictions. You lose control over a lot of the assets, and that's something that mineral owners are not always keen to do. There are other devices out there, but I would say that something like a revocable living trust or a family LLC or something would be by far the most common and the most flexible for mineral owners.
Okay. And it sounds like the examples you've given, there's some that can be set up to transfer ownership of minerals either before death or after death? And how is that handled? Is it really dependent on the specific entity and or the wording of any governing documents? Can you talk about how that's determined?
Sure. So that's a good question. The transfer of minerals, the revocable living trust, one of the advantages that you get is that you think of it as an open box. You can put things into the box and take things out of the box at any point while you're still alive. And that gives mineral owners a lot of flexibility. They can buy and sell, readjust their mineral portfolios as needed, as long as they're alive. And then once they die, then the box closes and then everything's managed according to the trust documents from there. If you're shifting these assets around, say with family members ahead of time, there's also no real problem in doing that as well, as long as you keep track of that and you make notes of it. The current If you wanted to make these in the form of a gift, you can gift these to your kids or gift your mineral rights to the kids if you're trying to transfer those assets around before you pass away. I think the gift tax exclusion right now is like $30,000 a year. I'd have to double check. It's been a little while since I've looked, but you can give out, a certain amount of your minerals every year without having to pay any taxes at all on it. And so it's something that mineral owners can keep in mind. But there aren't a lot of restrictions on ownership or on transferring those properties. You can change the timing, you can change what you have and what you don't, and the trusts are a pretty flexible way to do that.
Okay. And you mentioned some of the learnings, I guess we'll call it, or mistakes that you've seen clients make or that you've seen out in the industry. What are some of those biggest mistakes that you've seen or most common mistakes when it comes to estate planning?
When it comes to estate planning, I mean, I think the cardinal sin, I suppose, would be to pay the money to do an estate plan and then not follow it up by properly funding your trust. You end up in that situation where you have all of these great documents and none of them work because you haven't put the things in there that are supposed to be, or you haven't gotten the rest of the paperwork done. So, just creating a trust doesn't automatically protect your assets. It's the way that those assets are put into that box and then the way that they're managed. From an estate planning perspective, that's one big issue. The other big issue with mineral owners, and the hardest thing that I still have with mineral owners, is what do you own? And that question of what do you own, what mineral rights do you have, and where are they, is one that is so many mineral owners just I got these and then I sold some of these in this place, and I have mineral ownership across 5 different townships or 10 different townships in certain sections, and I may have sold some of these. I'm not sure exactly what got bought and sold. I just signed the paperwork, and knowing what you own and keeping an accurate inventory of what you have, I think is one of the most important things you can do as a mineral. So, I mean, those are two, both from an estate planning perspective, making sure that you properly fund your trust and properly follow through on your estate planning documents. But then as a mineral owner, also knowing what you own and keeping track of your assets and making sure that you making sure that you know what you own.
Sure. And I guess it goes back to, like you said, that annual update or that periodic update where you get with your estate attorney and make sure that everything is up to date and accurate. And that's going to go a long way for your heirs and avoiding any headaches or hassles down the road.
Boy, it really does, because if you miss, even if you have the trust and even if you've done some of the funding, if you miss anything, you've got any of the estate or any of the mineral rights that you miss are going to have to go through probate. And then, it's not that you've wasted the estate plan, but you're also tacking on 3, 4, or $5,000 in additional expenses to get those transferred. And so, making sure that all of that is done and making sure that your estate plan is ready and will work when you need it is just it's one of the things that I preach throughout my interactions with the clients, and it's one of the most important things to me as an estate planning attorney, is to make sure that we're not just putting a nice pretty binder on your desk. This is an actual active plan and something that has to go through an active planning and review process.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. And to that end, what should mineral owners look for when hiring an estate attorney? Along with that, is experience with minerals and royalties a prerequisite?
Yes, I would say so. And You don't have to have a estate planning attorney. I mean, or you don't have to have somebody that's necessarily familiar with minerals and royalties, but it really helps. And it helps somebody to understand that. Because lots of times an estate planning attorney will go through your list of assets and they won't catch the mineral rights, or they won't catch kind of the intricacies of the mineral rights. And that may have been what happened in the case that I was describing earlier, where the individual, had these mineral rights and they just never got transferred in. The estate planning attorney may not have known to do that. I would honestly consider that malpractice, but I know that that happens a lot more than you would want to think. So when mineral owners are looking for somebody, or they're looking for an estate planning attorney, looking for somebody that's got that experience and that's worked with minerals before, can be a real value for them, because not only are you doing the estate plan and making sure that your minerals are taken care of as part of that planning process, you also have the advantage of talking to somebody and working with somebody that you can run your mineral questions off on as well, and say, oh, hey, by the way, be an issue in this place or that place. I'm not exactly sure what I own here. How do I go about getting that resolved? So for mineral owners, I feel like it's a win-win if you're working with an estate planning attorney that has experience working with minerals as well.
That's a great point, because if you do need to go through probate to clear up any title issues on a property, they are already equipped to help you with that. Is that true?
Yeah, that's true. I mean, and they've thought about that process, or they've thought about that ahead of time and have been able to keep you out of probate, because with proper planning.
Sure. Now, you mentioned that process being important in terms of hiring a qualified estate attorney, but I guess from a mineral owner perspective, there needs to be some homework that's done beforehand in order to make the most of that interaction. So, what should mineral owners do, and kind of what are some of the types of questions they should ask themselves to prepare for that initial consultation?
I think both of you guys have mentioned, as we're talking here, that just that initial question of what do you own, and keep track of what you own and where you own it and what's happening with it. Estate planning attorneys, like I'm not a mind reader. I don't know, I can't figure this stuff out, or it's going to cost a whole lot for me to try and figure out what you own if you're not keeping track of it. Those title opinions and that transfer process can get really expensive if you have to continue, or if the estate planning attorney or somebody is doing the research for you. So, I think the most important thing that a mineral owner can do to help, their estate planning attorney, is just keep track of what they own and know what they own, know where the royalties are coming from, and manage this the way that you would manage a business. If this was a family owned business, you would manage your inventory, you would manage your cash forecast, you would know what you're selling is, and how much it's making, and you'd have a good handle on all these things. And I think treating minerals the same way would really help a lot of mineral owners doing estate planning, but also just from an organizational standpoint, just being more organized and knowing more about their own business.
I totally agree. I think there's a lot that goes into managing your minerals and royalties, and hopefully this discussion has helped people think about some things that they can be doing to help with the from an estate planning point of view. And on that note, what are some of your favorite resources that are out there that mineral owners can use to educate themselves about some of these considerations we've been talking about around estate planning, before they go talk with their estate planning attorney, or before they go and put that estate plan together or to update it?
Well, sure. So I put information out, of course, on my website. There's a lot of blogs and a lot of resources out there. Attorneys are generally very free with information. So, even a quick Google search, if you have a question, can get you answers. There are organizations out there like the National Association of Royalty Owners, NARO. I'm on the board of directors for that organization for the state of Colorado. That's a great place to go if you have questions. There's a national organization with state chapters, but Mineral Owners Forum, or Mineral Rights Forum, is a website that's dedicated to mineral owners. That can be a really good place to find information. So there's plenty of places you can go on the internet and do some of the research for free for yourself. But a lot of times too, if you have questions, I tell people all the time, just pick up the phone and and make an appointment with an estate planning attorney. Lots of people offer free consultations. I'm more than happy to talk with mineral owners that have questions. If they have questions about a lease, or if they have questions about, how to manage the mineral rights, even if it's just something small and it's not something that they would necessarily hire me for. Being in a position where we have so much information and have done all of this research before, I'm happy to share that information with people who need help. And that's one of my favorite parts of the job. So check around the internet. There's a lot of resources there. Check around, my website has some resources as well. I've got a webinar coming up tomorrow evening, if this goes out before then, but I've got a webinar coming up, and there's webinars that come up occasionally for other places too. So that information is out there. And if you can't find an answer, don't hesitate to pick up the phone and see if you can talk to somebody, and, through a free 15-minute consultation or a free 30-minute consultation, get some answers.
Yeah. And what website?
So it's www.kinneylawoffice.com.
And that's Kinney?
Yes.
Okay. Great. And is there anything else you'd like to mention before we wrap up?
Boy, it's been a pleasure. And I hope the people who are listening, if you're a mineral owner and you have questions, I hope you've gotten some of them answered. And we've had a good discussion on the mix between estate planning and mineral rights. But knowing what you own is important. Managing your mineral rights in the way that you would manage a business interest is important. And I look forward to hearing from anybody, but you're not alone in managing your minerals. And there's a lot of people out there who can help. And, don't be afraid to reach out when you have questions.
Absolutely. And you mentioned your website. How else can people find you?
Oh boy, I'm all over social media, or I try to be all over social media. I've got a Facebook page for the firm. You can also get a hold of me on my personal Facebook page if you feel like doing that. I've got a Twitter page for the firm. I've got a LinkedIn page for the firm. And there's also just a web search should take you to my website as well. So there's lots of ways to get in touch. And I hope that there's a lot of information, again, that's on my website. And I hope you find it helpful. And if you have any more questions, feel free to give me a call.
Absolutely. So again, you can get a hold of Ben and go to KinneyLawOffice.com. His contact information is there. And I think you had information on the webinar too on the website as well. Is that right?
Yep. I have a events page where you can see the upcoming events. Some of them are estate planning events. I've got a few mineral rights events coming up, and that will be updated here in the next day or two for the events for the rest of August and then going into September. So feel free to check it out. There's also, like I said, a resource page there, and there's a lot of free information that you can get. So
great. Yeah. And so definitely check that out. Go to the events page, the calendar there. The next webinar that he mentioned was how to manage your mineral rights for profit. That's being put on behalf of Colorado NARO, which I'm also a part of. So definitely, if you missed this one coming up on August 6th of 2020, go to Ben's website and see what's coming up next, and you can sign up there. So thanks again, Ben, for your time. We appreciate it.
Thank you very much for the opportunity. I hope this was helpful. And really, it's been a pleasure to talk to you guys today.
Thanks so much, Ben. Great to meet you.
Thanks so much for listening to the Mineral Rights Podcast with your host, Matt Sands. Don't forget to subscribe and share at mineralrightspodcast.com. The Mineral Rights Podcast should not be construed as investment, legal, or tax advice. All information is believed to be from reliable sources. However, we make no representation as to its completeness or accuracy.